Hey guys, in this video we're talking about the good side of GDP. That's right, the positives of GDP. Now, why are we shooting this video? Because there's a lot of detractors of GDP, and to tell you the truth, that's probably a really good thing, okay? GDP definitely has some issues, and we think probably the big issues with GDP is that we ask that number, that economic statistic, to just tell us too much or do too much, okay? We need to understand the limitations of GDP, but that's not what this video is about, though we're gonna talk about those limitations a little bit. It's really about why GDP is still used as a macroeconomic indicator and why that might be a good thing. Now, before we get going, I want you to understand that when we talk about GDP, we're going to be talking about real GDP, okay? So we're getting rid of all the distortions of changes in the value of the dollar, which we can absolutely do, and really GDP per capita, taking GDP, which is the total value of goods and services produced in a country domestically, and dividing that by the population. Again, GDP, the total value of goods and services produced domestically, take that number divided by the population, and you get the total value of goods and services produced per person. That's per capita, right? And so we're talking about real GDP per capita. Now, again, before we get to the positives of GDP, let's talk about a few of those big issues that are out there, and they are big issues. GDP, first of all, tells us nothing about income inequality, and we need to understand that. So GDP per capita, really good, let's say, it's really big, it's a large number. It's not telling us anything about the inequality that might exist in that country, and we need to look towards that inequality, see how much of it there is. We have something called the Gini coefficient, which would be a great statistic to ask for anytime somebody might be quoting GDP per capita to you. Another thing is, it gives us no insight to the environmental impact. This is a big issue, huge issue about GDP, is it doesn't look at the environmental impact of the production. Again, it's looking at the total value of goods and services produced with no eye towards the environmental impacts of that. So we definitely need to understand how much of the energy is maybe coming from fossil fuels, other types of pollutants that might be coming from the production. What's going on with the amount of forest land in your country. There's a lot to keep our eyes on that GDP gives us no insight into. And then finally, GDP is an amoral measurement. It doesn't really have a moral compass, okay? If the market values it, if supply and demand, it comes together and gives us a price, we throw that price in. We don't really look at maybe if the market is over or undervaluing a particular good or service. We just take whatever the market price is. Maybe if, there might have been some taxes or subsidies going on, but generally what the market price is, and we put that into GDP. So there's three big issues with the number, but again, this is about the good side of GDP. Now, here is the thing. We're going to organize this into two columns, okay? There's the in human control, and this is really the good side of GDP per capita, that is. And then there's the out of control that we definitely want to understand certainly affects GDP per capita. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the out of control first, because really what we're trying to say is the in control matters a ton, and most of this is probably more important than even this stuff, okay? Though certainly some of this is important as we go through it. First of all, climate and geography. Geography, you're thinking about the number of natural resources that already exist in a country. It seems that data is showing, the data has shown that this is not quite as important as we used to think it was, say, a century or two ago. Okay, so much of high value production has to do with the overall skill set of your population. Geography maybe is not as big as we thought. Again, one of the big examples is Japan, not rich in natural resources, but still their GDP per capita is much higher than so much of the world that is out there. Climate also can be important, certainly, and geography can be important, don't get me wrong. Climate also important. Tropical areas seem to have had problems here, but you do have countries such as Singapore, who has a tropical climate generally, and they have very strong GDP per capita numbers. There's also demography, okay? Demography is also an issue if your workforce is aging, and so your overall workforce is shrinking, I should say. If your population is aging, therefore your workforce is shrinking, that can be a problem, especially GDP per capita. If the number of workers is having to support a larger and larger, or the number of workers is shrinking and supporting maybe the same size population or a slightly bigger population. And then finally, the history. And right here, we really want to focus on residual colonial impacts, okay? So countries that used to be colonies, and then kind of what was their institutional structure when they were a colony. That's so important, and seeing if there's any residual impacts, okay? So certainly these things are important, and some of these, perhaps that residual impacts of colonies being way up there because of its institutional impacts, are quite important. But here is the good side of GDP, okay? GDP as a single number does give us some insight into these things, okay? The level of human capital, the quality of your labor, the health of your labor force, the education, the skill sets, the technical, the vocational, the managerial skill sets of your labor force. Such an important contributor to your GDP per capita, how healthy and how educated your labor force is. And then all these other institutions that really do seem to play into GDP. They're so important for GDP as we tease out the data. Things like how fair and efficient your tax system is, how fair and efficient your judicial system is. Also, the degrees of checks and balances and separation of powers that you have in your government. Such an important thing. Free press. This is one of my personal favorites here. Free press. I love to just tell students, hey, correlate the degree of free press with the GDP that's out there. And when I say do that, free press, what I want you to do is look at how many people in the press have been jailed, okay? And if we're looking for numbers that are extremely low, right? When we think about a free press, we want to think about people, the press, having the confidence that they can write anything they want about the government, pretty much, as long as they're not inciting a riot, but they can write anything that they want, okay, in criticism of a government or a government official without worry of retribution at all. How free is your press? So important. You just go look at countries that have extremely free presses, and you're going to find high GDP per capita. It falls under these institutions. It really is related to this checks and balances and separation of powers. And then also property rights are so important, okay? Whose property rights are we enforcing? Are we enforcing everybody's property rights? Are you totally feel confident that your property isn't going to be taken by any individuals, and also, of course, not by the government itself? That if you produce value, you're going to get to keep a lot of that value. You're going to get a lot of the fruits of your labor or the fruits of your innovation. Do you feel very secure in your property rights? And this also leads into risk taking, which I almost put on the board, but it just kind of falls. I'm going to put it under this property rights. Do you have an economy that awards risk taking, okay? These things, these kind of institutional and the quality of your labor, your human capital, they, as you tease out the data, have proven to be incredibly important for GDP per capita. And what we're looking for is countries that have high GDP per capita, and then we're looking at that GDP per capita over time. Does it remain quite high? Is it increasing at a moderate pace, okay? Is it continues to increase? Does it remain high? That's what we're looking for. It does give us insight into so much of a country. That's right. The total value of goods and services that a country is producing does, just in a single number, give us a lot of insight into things that we care a ton about. Yes, there's problems with GDP. There's no doubt about it. And here's the thing. Don't look at GDP for all kinds of other things you might care about, like standard of living, because you need so much more than just GDP per capita for standard of living. But it is giving you some insight that is really important. Hope that makes sense to you. We'll talk to you in the next video.